Hi guys, today we'll tell you mini story Day of the Dead. Let's start.
Easy. And number 3, I might. If you don't know the end, use you. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, he arrived
Yes.
on Guatemala.
So I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
He arrived in Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
AJ arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead. November 1st.
Well, me, AJ. Right? I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, he arrived Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
No, I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
He arrived on Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
He arrived on Guatemala on the day of the in Guatemala on the day of the November 1st.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No. He would not angry with the holiday.
No, I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, he wasn't sad about this holiday.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
AJ was curious about this holiday.
Well, I was, AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
He was curious about the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
The holiday. Right? I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
He curious.
Which holiday was I curious about?
He was curious about the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
No, he was curious about the Day of the Dead on the 1st November.
No, I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
He go to the cemetery.
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
He go to cemetery.
Easy. I went to the cemetery.
I'm sorry.
Who went to the cemetery?
AJ went to cemetery.
Well, me, right, AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
He went to a cemetery.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
He went cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
November 1st, the Day of the Dead. Right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
Because he want to see what happening on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Well, to see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening? Me, AJ, went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
In Guatemala.
In Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
It's a holiday.
A holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
The Day of the Dead on November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead was and is November 1st. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting. Was it boring?
No, it's interesting, quite interesting.
No, it wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yes, it's quite interesting.
Yes, it was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel about the cemetery?
He felt quite interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
Interesting. It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
Well, cemetery.
The cemetery. The cemetery was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting? It
On the day of the dead, November 1st.
was interesting on the day of the dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Was the atmosphere very sad?
No, it were like a party.
No, the atmosphere was not sad. The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
Happy. The atmosphere was happy.
There was happy. The atmosphere was like a party. What was like a party?
The atmosphere were a party. Atmosphere.
The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
Party.
Where was the atmosphere like a party?
The cemetery. Cemetery.
In the cemetery. The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No. The atmosphere like a party at cemetery.
No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Where were the families sitting?
Around the grave.
Around the graves. Right? They were sitting around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves?
The family were sitting around the grave.
The families. Right? The families were sitting around the graves. Were they sitting around the trees?
No, here they are sitting. They were sitting around the graves.
No, they weren't sitting around the trees. They were sitting around the graves. So, where were they sitting?
He was sitting around graves.
Around the graves. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes. They were sitting around the grave.
Yes, they were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their friends?
No. Thank you for watching.
No, not really.
Thank you for
They
watching.
were sitting around the